Hello and welcome to the Ecological Threats Towards 2050, Understanding Ecological Threats, Resilience and Peace webinar. My name is Ahmed Keskin. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Intercultural Society, and it gives me great pleasure on behalf of the AIS to partner with the Institute for Economics and Peace and the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law, UNSW.
Thanks, Ahmed.
May I start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands that we are standing on. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This topic is very timely considering COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, is due to take place soon. Our world is grappling with the coronavirus right now, but climate change is a real and serious challenge to our way of life. Increases in population, the degradation of natural resources and climate change are increasing the occurrence of ecological events. These events will result in heightened poverty and an increased likelihood of conflict and mass migration. Research from the Institute for Economics and Peace shows that by 2050, the global population is projected to reach 10 billion, with the larger population increases occurring in countries with the highest level of conflict. This webinar will explore how we can create more resilient societies so we adapt to extreme ecological shocks now and into the future, including Australian responses. And we have a wonderful lineup of experts to comment on this. By way of introduction, and in no particular order, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert Glasser, who is the head of the ASPI Climate and Security Policy Centre and Honorary Associate Professor at the Australian National University. He was previously the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and head of the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. Dr. Glasser was a member of the UN Secretary General's Senior Management Group and Deputy Secretary General Climate Principles Group. Dr. Glasser has over 30 years of experience as a practitioner, advocate and policymaker in the areas of climate change, sustainable development and disaster risk management. We also have Steve Killelea AM, who is the founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Over the last 2 decades, Steve has applied his business skills to his many global philanthropic activities, including the private family charity, the Charity Foundation, and in 2010, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for his service to community through the Global Peace Movement. And in 2013, a coalition of Australian foundations recognised his funding of IEP as one of the 50 most impactful gifts in Australia's history. And in 2016, he was awarded the Luxembourg Peace Prize. Professor Jane McAdam is Scientia Professor and Director of Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at UNSW Sydney. She's a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and the Australian Academy of Law. Professor McAdam publishes widely in international refugee law and forced migration, with a particular focus on displacement in the context of climate change and disasters. She wrote many books, including Climate Change, Forced Migration and International Law, also The Refugee in International Law, and she also wrote the Oxford Handbook of International Refugee Law. She's also editor-in-chief in the leading journal in the field, the International Journal of Refugee Law, and she was appointed Order of Australia in 2021 for distinguished service to international refugee law, particularly to climate change and the displacement of people. And to moderate the conversation, we have Anthea Batsakiz, who is a Deputy Editor of Environment and Energy at The Conversation. Prior to that, she worked as Deputy Editor of Politics and Society. And before joining The Conversation, Anthea worked as a journalist with articles published in The Cosmos, The New Daily, Crikey, Australian Geographic and more. And she's held roles at the Herald Sun and in communications at the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. You can engage in this conversation by making your comments in the chat section, and feel free to ask questions there as well. It might be good to just put Q and dash or something like that so that we know that it is a question, and feel free to mention who the question is directed to. And now I'd like to hand over to Anthea to moderate the conversation. Hi, Anthea.
Hi, thanks, Ahmed. So now, as Ahmed mentioned, in less than 2 weeks' time, international leaders will be meeting in Glasgow for COP26. A lot of people are calling it the world's last best chance to stop global warming beyond 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is our best case scenario, but it'll still lock in more frequent and severe disasters, from floods to heat waves. If the world gets hotter, we'll see impacts like disasters, droughts, and food insecurity worsen, and greater ecological collapse around the world. The new report from the Institute for Economics and Peace talks about how ecological degradation is deeply tied to conflict and the outbreaks of violence. One of the main findings of the report is that it's a vicious cycle, that violent disputes and depletion of resources like food and water reinforce one another. Another finding is that more than 1.26 billion people across 30 countries live in both extreme ecological risk and low levels of resilience. This means they are least likely to mitigate or adapt to these threats, and as a result, will experience mass displacement. The report also makes projections out to 2050 and finds that by then, 3.4 billion people will experience food insecurity. With this much at stake, it's so important that these risks are taken into account by leaders at the Climate Summit next month. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at the report's key findings. Steve, perhaps a good place to start is to briefly unpack what the Ecological Threat Report actually is, and if you could give a few examples of which countries are most at risk.
No, that's fine. So if we look at the Ecological Threat Register, it looks at the 9 different domains, which it then measures to then assess the risk of ecological damage. So on one side, we've got what we call resources, and that comes down to availability of water, food, and population growth. On the other comes down to natural disasters. So they're like increases in temperatures. It'll be natural disasters like tsunamis, also includes hurricanes, floods, and droughts. Now, what we do then is we assess the likelihood of these things, and then we look at the resilience which various countries around the world have. And it's the combination of low or high ecological threat combined with the low societal resilience, and they're the ones which are most likely to have issues. And as Anthea was saying, I think the key finding of this is that we've got this vicious cycle with ecological degradation. It's getting worse. Now, the interrelationship between conflict and ecological degradation is so strong. So of the 15 countries with the highest level of threats, 11 of them are currently in conflict, another 4 on watch lists for conflicts. So with the 30 hotspot countries, and they're the country that consists of 1.26 billion people, and so they're the countries very low societal resilience and high levels of ecological threat. We find out of them, 8 of the 10 of those 30 countries and the 10 least peaceful countries in the world, and 28 of the 30 are in the bottom half of the Global Peace Index. Now, these are also, many of these countries, the ones with the highest population increase. So, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, that's a place of really true focus. So over the next 30 years, because a lot of the work in the index is extrapolated out to 2050, a lot of the population in sub-Saharan Africa is going to increase by 90%. You have 12 countries where the population is going to be more than double. And Niger, the expected increase there is 161%. So that's truly threatening. Of the 30 hotspot countries, 18 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. And we look today, and we looked at the levels of food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa, 66% of the population is food insecure. Now, if we look at the drivers of ecological degradation, they're only going to get worse too. So we'll just take one stat, which we'll probably come back to further on. But if we look at that, if we look at the number of food insecure people, that had been improving for decades up to 2014. But since then, it's reversed. Every year it's got worse. So today, we've got 2.3 billion people who are food insecure. That's over about 30% of the world's population. And then that's an increase of 44% since 2014, and a big jump during COVID-19. Food prices in the last 2 years, if we look at the Global Food Index, is up 26%. So now, what are some of these countries which we consider most at risk? So the countries like, and there's a lot of them. It depends just how strong the shocks are in the future. But at the moment, we'd have the highest ones on the watch list to be places like Bangladesh, Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, all 3 Guineas, Haiti, and Republic of Congo. And we can see in a number of those countries, we can actually, since we've done the report and coinciding with the production of the report, we can see there's been stresses around peace in a number of these different countries already. Maybe I'll stop there.
No, that is pretty eye-opening and tragic. Now, one thing I saw is how the report makes projections out to 2050, and I was wondering that by making these projections, what is IEP hoping to achieve?
I think the projections give us some insight into what the state of the world might be like in 2050, but more importantly, it gives you an opportunity to be able to look at where we should have our major focuses. Because quite often, I'm sure Robert will be able to attest to this, we act in a reactive mode. We don't act in a proactive mode. And I think the other thing which we're trying to get across with this, climate change is truly a threat to the planet. And climate change, which will be a magnifying effect on all these ecological issues, but they're today. And if we don't start to look at addressing them, what we're likely to do is end up with just the levels of conflict in some parts of the world just increasing. And once you get into a conflict trap, it's very, very hard to get out.
Absolutely. And the report mentions the phrase violent tipping points. Steve or Robert, could you please give us examples of how ecological issues build to eventually set a country over the edge into violence? And have we seen this happen in countries in the past?
Okay, I'll just go quickly if you like, Robert. So yes, look, what's quite remarkable is if you look at some of the most conflicted countries in the world, they've got the worst ecological scores. The one with the worst ecological score in the world is Afghanistan. It's also the least peaceful. But down, you'll find in those ones, you'll find Iraq, Syria, Yemen, just to name a couple as well. If we went back to 2019, the two countries in the world with most water conflicts were Syria and Iraq, just to drive it home. But what happens is you get the ecological degradation, it's a vicious cycle, so you get an ecological degradation. That leads to some conflict. Okay, the conflict breaks out, and then you may get more rains for a while, you may get a peace deal put in place, but again, the ecology is degrading, gets worse, which fuels people back into conflict. So that happens, they then fall back lines, which could be ethnic lines, religious lines, cultural lines, and then that just increases the conflict again, which degrades the further. And then eventually you get to a point where the state fails, and that's really where you get a tipping point. But at this point, I'll stop and pass it over to Robert.
Yeah, maybe just to add to Steve's comments, there are so many increasing number of examples of this. There was Darfur region where prolonged drought caused an upsurge in violence because the herders had to move into areas that they had not traditionally moved into and came into conflict with farming communities. There was the 2010 and 11 food security crisis that led to a spike of food prices and was a contributing factor in the Arab Spring that saw violence and the overthrow of governments. And there was the example Steve gave a moment ago of Syria, where you had this regional, multi-year, unprecedented drought, at least in modern times, that caused hundreds of thousands of people to move from rural areas into cities, where they were a factor in the Syrian revolution, which then saw massive refugee movements into Europe, which contributed to the UK's exit from the EU. So we're beginning to see the scale of these events causing huge displacements and contributions to conflict as well.
Well, speaking of displacements, Jane, the report found that at the end of 2020, 82.4 million people were forcibly displaced. That's the highest number on record. You've written about how people tend to move when environmental pressures become too great in the past. Can you briefly talk us through the complex relationships between climate change and human mobility?
Yes, and thank you. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this important panel. Yeah, I mean, you've highlighted the big figures in terms of movement for a range of different reasons. But we know that last year there were close to 31 million internal displacements on account of the impacts of disasters, and they are anticipated to worsen with climate change. So in that sense, we would anticipate that we will see greater movement each year, and that's already comprising 75% of internal displacement compared to 25% on account of conflict. What we also know is that most people are likely to move within their own countries, certainly initially, but a lot of people will never cross an international border. Some will, and that's where we confront some of the legal and policy gaps, because at the moment, the protection regime under refugee law will only aid a few of those people. And by and large, there'll be some of the people that have already been referred to, those who are moving in the context of increasing conflict, persecution and the like, who satisfy the refugee definition. A large number of people won't fit into that category. So the question remains, well, what happens to them when they cross a border? I think what we need to make really clear, though, is this multi-causality point. Climate change alone doesn't trigger movement. It's always in combination with other factors. And I think some of the examples already provided, unprecedented drought, food scarcity in the backdrop of conflict, vulnerable groups facing even more precarious circumstances. And then you put climate change and increasing or more frequent disasters or more severe disasters into the mix, and you've kind of got the perfect storm. So another way of looking at it is that climate change multiplies vulnerability. We often talk about climate change as a risk multiplier, but Andrew Harper from UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, in the Kaldor Centre's conference on this topic this week, said a better way to think about it is a vulnerability multiplier, because very often it's the people who are already in marginalised or impoverished conditions who are going to be the worst affected. And indeed, what's interesting is that when we count displacement, what's being counted are the number of displacements as opposed to the number of people per se, because very often it's the same people being displaced over and over again. Of course, what we also know is that most people would rather stay in their home. They don't want to be displaced, but nor would they ideally move away from harm. But at the same time, the reality is that people are already having to relocate out of harm's way in some countries, and I can speak to that a little bit more later on. But I think what that shows is that we need to have an eye on this now. This is not a future problem, it's a current problem. Well, it is a future problem, but it's also a present problem, and we need to be addressing it and planning for it now. And I think too, we are only going to see further the compounding and cascading effects of multiple drivers of movement. And the evidence shows that if people are adequately assisted promptly at the outset, then they're far more likely to have the resources and the ability to go home and rebuild quickly. Whereas if they never get that assistance in the first place, that's when you're going to see prolonged and protracted displacement and all the attendant human rights consequences that flow from that.
Yeah, and what kind of resources?
In terms, right, so I mean, there's a range of different things, but I mean, I think initially when people are displaced, they obviously need to have urgent humanitarian, well, they may need to have urgent humanitarian assistance. I mean, saving people's lives is the kind of preeminent thing that matters, but at the same time, you can't save a life without having adequate food and water and shelter and medical supplies and so on. So there's that initial humanitarian response of assistance, but at the same time, ideally we would avoid even getting to that if we had adequate funding and resources available to put in place disaster risk reduction measures and adaptation measures, but also, and I can talk about this a little bit later, migration strategies, so that migration itself can be a form of adaptation that enables people to move in advance of harm.
Now, Robert, you've witnessed many of the trends noted in the report firsthand when you worked for the international aid organisation CARE. Can you tell us a bit about what you experienced and what people living in these at-risk countries felt were their biggest challenges?
Wow. Yes, I've seen wonderful examples of humanity and people just doing amazing things in spite of the fact that they have absolutely nothing, and helping their neighbors as well. But and I've certainly seen at CARE increasing examples of climate impacts, including connections to food and conflict. And one example was a trip CARE used to manage, maybe it still does, the Darfur, the Dadaab refugee camp on the border of Kenya and Somalia. And just to give you an idea of the scale of these challenges, this Dadaab refugee camp was actually, if you looked at it, the 4th largest city in Kenya. And anyway, we saw very clearly the connection between poverty, climate, and the huge distances refugees had to travel, and the compounding effects of conflict and climate disruptions, as well as the opportunities to generate more conflict, because there was also recruitment into terrorist organizations occurring as a result of the refugee and the displacement. Visited Ethiopia and spoke with an Ethiopian farmer through an interpreter as well during this was the 2010 and 11 drought. And it was the 3rd drought in less than a decade. And I asked this elderly Ethiopian farmer if he remembered when he was a child ever having a drought of this magnitude. And there'd been 3 of them now in less than a decade. And he said he could only remember 1 in his life. He said his father took them into the bush and they lived on bush food, and that's how they survived. Well, when I looked around, there's no bush left anywhere near this fellow because of population growth and development. So that key coping mechanism was gone. And just to give you an insight into his perspective on these challenges, and I said, well, why now you see 3 of these events in less than 10 years? Why is this happening? And his response was, I think God is punishing me for not working hard enough. So now he was going to work even harder, even though he had no responsibility for these developments, which were very clearly linked to climate change, particularly the failure of the short rains. So that was just a really sad reminder of how we were failing in wealthy countries to take responsibility for the changes, where here was this farmer who had nothing left and he was going to work harder.
Well, Robert, what do you think the international community should do and wealthy countries should do to support these countries that are most at risk? And Jane.
Wow, well, some of the work Steve and his organizations are doing is a good start, and the work Australia's aid program is doing. But, you know, the scale of these challenges are so huge, and they're accelerating so rapidly because of climate change combined with population growth and development patterns, that we really need to start focusing on really strategic interventions, and a lot of them are in agriculture, like drought-resistant crops and and some actually old models that have disappeared, like ag extension, which was a core part of dealing with previous food security crises, and we've sort of moved on. Aid programs have sort of forgotten about those things. We have to revisit those, but on a much larger scale. But there's such a broad range of issues, things we need to be focusing on now, and not enough money to do it. And of course, wealthy countries are going to be pummeled by disasters as well. So it's going to be harder, I think, to mobilize public support for aid and other interventions. So we've got a big challenge ahead of us.
Absolutely. And Jane, did you have anything to add on this? I know you mentioned migration as an adaptation strategy.
That's right. I mean, I think that very often displacement is sometimes framed as a security threat itself, and it certainly doesn't need to be. I mean, I think if we flip it instead to look at the human security aspect, the needs of people who are themselves affected, and how we can assist people as their general desire is to stay at home. I mean, that's not to say we don't want them to come here, keep them at home. It's actually to respond to people's own wishes to be able to stay in place, but recognizing that that won't always be possible. And as you noted in your introduction, even if emissions were to stop today, we're still going to see worsening disasters for some period of time yet, and we know that there will be some displacement. So, you know, how do we ensure there is that funding and support to assist communities to adapt where that's possible, but at the same time, where migration can be used as a strategy through remittances, through livelihood diversification, to relieve pressure on fragile ecosystems in a home country, all those factors, but also to enable people to take control of their own destiny. Because I think at the moment, if the setting is you've just got to stay put until you tipped over the edge and you're displaced from your home, then people are kind of, you know, left there as sitting ducks, as opposed to saying, if you wish to move, here is a safe and legal pathway that you can do so. And I mean, if I can just give an example, which isn't framed in any way as a climate change response, but actually enables that. New Zealand for a long time has had a visa category that in its most recent iteration is called the Pacific Access category. And that gives permanent residence opportunities to a number of Pacific Island countries each year, so that people can move as permanent residents to New Zealand, re-establish their lives and their families there, in the knowledge that it's not just a temporary scheme, that they don't, you know, have to go home every 6 months or every 3 years or whatever it might be. And so that gives people some longer term security. It gives them opportunities to decide if and when they wish to move. And it's you know, it is seen among Pacific communities as one way of adapting to the impacts of climate change, even though, as I say, it was never envisaged for that particular reason.
And Steve, did you have anything to add, perhaps relating back to the policy?
Sorry, I missed what you said then. There was a bit of background noise.
Oops, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep, there it goes again.
It might be the road.
So what was the question?
Question was, I was just asking if you had anything to add on this, perhaps relating back to the policy recommendations made in the ETR report.
Sure. I'll make a couple of comments. So I think first up, following on a little bit from Jane's comments, is when we're looking at refugees as and UNHCR, and there's sort of 83 million of them currently. They're people who are displaced in 5 different categories, but they're mainly conflicts. There'll be Palestinians, people placed through ongoing conflicts. There's another category for Venezuelans and 2 others as well. And so they generally be long-term displacement. And what we find is 1/3 of them move more than 500 kilometres from where they're displaced. Whereas quite often what happens with the natural disasters, so let's say floods, a tsunami, a drought, the people are displaced, but then they tend to come back afterwards. So it's a different, so the first thing is they're different types of displacements. So I think it's good to sort of understand the dynamics around those 2 different scenarios, because they're quite different. Now, what I want to just think of Afghanistan. So I'm going to take the most conservative number I've come across so far, and that's the cost of the US involvement in Afghanistan was $2.3 trillion. Now, that ignores all the money spent by all the other governments, and it also ignores the money the US spent in Pakistan. That's 100 times, okay, 100 times the per capita income for an Afghan. 100 times. Now, if you'd just given them 10 times their per capita income, would have that created a better outcome? And I think the thing to really drive home here is it doesn't matter how much money we spend on development, unless the development's right, we're not going to solve our issues and problems. So we've got a lot of focus on the Sahel at the moment, because it's probably the rising hotspot of Islamic terrorists. It's got three of the 8 countries in the Sahel have had military coups in the last months, if you like. It's you've got the country with the highest population growth. Now, these problems are all systemic in nature. And this is hard. Like Robert might have some comments on this, but this is really hard. We need to somehow have systemic solutions to try and solve them. So let's look at the UN at the moment, and the UN does a lot of great work, really great work. So for the refugees, which you've got going on there, you've got UNHCR, you've got FAO, which looks at the agriculture, you've got UNDP, which looks at development, but then again, it's in silos as well. So you've got WASH programs, standard development programs. You've got military interventions there as well, a lot of French in there, but you've got UN peacekeeping as well. They're often a different category and group. And if you look at business, trying to stimulate the business, well, that's something different again. And then if you've got people like the World Bank and the IMF trying to build the governance structures in these weak countries at all. So if you've got systemic problems, you need systemic solutions. And so systemic solutions are integration of all these different things. But having said that, we don't analyse issues in a systemic way. We can talk about them in a siloed approach like I've been doing here or the rest of us have been doing. But truly, what you've got to do is understand the system in which this is operating, the way it's interacting, and then get a solution which is tailored around the systemic problem. And like, if we can do that, and then this is not easy, this is exceptionally hard to change large international institutions, but that's the first part I'd say is needed. The second part, which I can see, and so I've got a family foundation, we have over 220 different projects in the developing world now. We've got about 3.6 million direct beneficiaries. And I think what's missing in development is being able to harness business. So you can get the IMF or the World Bank, and they'll come in for macro projects like building a big dam and putting in highways and building electricity structures. But what's missing down into these really fragile areas is in the local community. How do you look at the business solutions? And they're there. I can see them because of my business background. They're there. How do you stimulate business solutions which work off capturing more water, developing agriculture off it, and then building the value-added industries? And these are small scale value-added industries off that agriculture. And so I think there's a whole area of solutions there. And I could go into a lot more detail, but given the time we've got, it's probably not right now.
Well, while we're on solutions, just a question for all of you, what do we want to see come out of COP26 relating to this? What are your hopes that the delegates will take from this report? Let's start with Robert.
Well, let's see. Fundamentally, we need ambitious climate action, and that is a key priority for the meeting, including an early action by 2030 to try and lift the ambition to maybe 40 or 50% reductions on by 2030. Because if climate continues to warm, if it goes beyond beyond 2 to 3 degrees, then everything else we're trying to do to help build the resilience of communities is just going to be overwhelmed by the scale of the hazards that are arriving very soon. There's been a 20-fold increase in just the last decade in extreme heat events. That's from less than a degree of warming. A 10-centimeter rise in sea level changes a 1 in 100-year extreme event to a 1 in 33-year event, and we're now expecting these events to become annual events. So if we don't get a handle on increasing temperature, then all bets are off. Similarly, because as Jane has already mentioned, we're already committed to warming probably to 1.5 degrees and possibly to 2, just because of the baked-in warming, the emissions over previous decades. We have to begin investing in adaptation and resilience. And this is the other piece of the Paris Agreement, the commitment, wealthy countries' commitments to spend $100 billion a year over the years 20 to 25, which they have not delivered yet, and that hoping to deliver at this outcome of the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow Summit.
Yeah, great. And Jane or Steve, did you have anything you'd like to add, or did that cover it off?
Look, I think that's covered it. I mean, all I'd say, and this isn't necessarily going to come out of Glasgow, but just to echo that point that Steve made, I mean, what we do need to see is a far more linked up and integrated approach to climate change, to disaster risk reduction, to sustainable development and mobility. And on the mobility side, that means looking at a range of international instruments that we now have, including the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, and various different things, because otherwise we will just maintain this siloed approach. And quite clearly, that's not going to get us where we need to be to address the ramifications of climate change.
Yeah, I think from my angle, I'd just like to see him get really serious about it. Like Robert commented on the 100 billion a year, but if we look at that money spent in Afghanistan, 100 billion a year, unless it's spent properly, it's not going to go nowhere. But we're living in an environment where the overseas developmental aid from most countries is shrinking. So I think just something blunt, like they need to get serious, I think is incredibly important. But for me, I think at the moment, unless they can start to get substantial reductions by 2030, we've got no way we're going to get anywhere near 1.5. I think at the moment, on the current trends, an aspirational goal would be a 50% probability of getting 2.3 degrees increase by 2100. And that's way different than the way everyone's talking. And I think there's just a lot of hype in the way governments are talking about this, and it's easy for them to kick the can down the road. Now, the three biggest, we did some, along with this ecological threat report, we did some polling, or worked on some polls which looked at the risk of climate change, and it sort of asked I think it's 250,000 people, 126,000 people from 142 countries, whether they thought climate change was a serious risk in the next 20 years. And the global average was about 50%. Now, when we look at the three biggest emitters, by far is China, US and India. So when you look in the US, it's about on average about 49.5%. China, it was 23%. So that's sixth lowest of any country polled. And India was at 35%. Now, in my mind, the battle for climate change is going to be won or lost in India and China. And both of them at this stage are highly committed to new coal-fired powered stations. And so the citizens in the country don't see it as a serious threat, then one wonders if the government does.
Well, speaking of China, one question I've been wondering is whether any of you think that China's deteriorating relations with the US, over things like human rights, the South China Sea, Taiwan, for example, whether that could complicate diplomacy around global climate action at COP26, or do you think they're separate issues? Let's start with Robert.
Well, I think China will pursue its national interests, as will the US. And I'm hoping, just to pick up on Steve's comment, that they now see the huge economic opportunity in the energy transformation, and that they see that as in their interest to accelerate that transition and to try and corner the market in a way on the technology side in particular. So I think just because of the economics of renewables, I think that is a solid piece that will, I shouldn't say categorically because the politics can affect everything, but I think that's an enduring trend that they hopefully will keep them on this track. In terms of, but it could undermine when they announce things, how they announce them. It could also undermine, it also could have an effect on internal politics in China. There were some interesting theories about why Xi is not attending the COP apparently, and also why he hasn't left the country in hundreds of days, which is really unusual for him since he's a big promoter of China. So yeah, anyway, so there are all those other political factors that could get in the way.
Yes, it's interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point, because it's 2 years now since he's left China. And for a world leader, that's a highly, highly unusual. But according to sort of what the Chinese are saying, is the sea climate change and the deterioration relation with the US, they see that as separate issues. So if we listen to the words which are said, then obviously it's not going to affect it. But one from a practical perspective, you have to wonder. The other thing too is sort of the economic progress. So while there's strong economic progress, or you're a wealthy nation, it makes it much easier to actually do the initiatives which are needed to sort of come over to clean energy. But if your economies are struggling, that's different. So that comes back to the global economy again, and we know that's in trouble for the next couple of years. So hopefully without turnaround in the global economy, all this gets a lot more difficult to do as well. It's very hard to tell an Indian that, look, you can't have a middle-class lifestyle while Europeans can because of the CO2 emissions. Very hard. If you're a politician, it's not a platform you'll get elected on.
Yeah, that point. Sorry, Jane, I don't know if you wanted to comment, but can I jump in just on that point, Steve? Yeah, when your economy is in trouble, it's harder to make those commitments. One of the most worrying things I saw, if for someone who's committed to overseas aid and work, was when I returned to Australia a couple of years ago from being away for 10 years. I was on a Qantas flight and we were landing, and I was ready for Qantas to pass around the Change for Good envelope for UNICEF. But instead of doing that, it was in the midst of the drought, and they passed around an envelope to help our drought-stressed farmers. And I thought, oh boy, as soon as it starts biting here, the commitment shifts a bit. And this is what worries me about how we're going to cope, how we're going to help others cope when we're ourselves suffering as well. Anyway.
If I could just jump in on that. Sorry, on that last point, it reminds me too, Robert, I recall reading that, shortly after the fires, there were Pacific Islanders walking around villages with wheelbarrows collecting for Australia. And I thought that's a very, very sobering thing to see. And when the shoe's on the other foot, we don't necessarily respond in the same way, notwithstanding the humanitarian aid and assistance that, of course, Australia gives within the Pacific. But I'm not sure that our communities would react quite so quickly.
How amazing is that image of Pacific Islanders collecting aid for Australia? I think that's just so profound and powerful. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I guess that brings me to my next and last question, I guess, before we open up to public questions. But I did want to quickly just talk about regional stability around Australia. So Robert, you've written in the past about disasters not only becoming more extreme, but occurring simultaneously around the world, and the threats this poses to global food security. You've noted that this could have major consequences for regional stability. Can you expand on how these will directly affect Australia's national interests?
I have to unmute. Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Steve's pointed out the extreme risk in sub-Saharan Africa, which is extreme, but I think we're also underestimating the huge impacts, particularly in the region to our immediate north, maritime Southeast Asia, and specifically in Indonesia, where you have 275 million people on predominantly low-lying island archipelagos. And when you consider the climate hazards that are striking Indonesia and maritime Southeast Asia, the fastest sea level rise rate globally, the huge exposure to extreme heat, and it's actually literally a hotspot, as are many places in the tropics, but Indonesia has been setting the highest records globally in terms of record heat events already. When you look at the exposure to El Nino and La Nina, particularly when you consider the 275 million people, whether it's El Nino or La Nina, Indonesia is right in the center of it throughout the whole year of those events. And climate science says the extreme El Ninos will double in frequency in less than 10 years. And so you put all of these things together: heat, drought, fires, torrential downpours, saltwater intrusion, stronger storms, crop pests, the change in the distribution, the collapse of reefs at, again, 90% of them in less than 10 years. And these are the fish nurseries for 10% of the global fish supply and the regional supply of fish, the population displacement. And you think of it as a system change. And then you note, and all of those things impact food. And you see in places like Indonesia, historically, where food insecurity has been a source of political instability and serious conflict, that we're really underestimating the impacts in our backyard. And in some respects, given the number of people involved, it will also be globally a significant hotspot of food insecurity and potentially conflict and other things. So yes, sorry that took so long to respond to, but it's deeply worrying. One of the things we're working on at ASPI is to try and raise attention on that issue.
Yeah, and I guess with all that in mind, Jane, do you think that Australia needs to overhaul our migration policy?
Well, not just Australia. I mean, I think just when Robert was speaking, it reminded me of the government of Kiribati, which secured a parcel of land in Fiji. And in the media, it was often portrayed as Kiribati buys land to relocate its people. Whereas the president of Kiribati acknowledged, well, without migration, visa opportunities, we can't just up and move. But he said it's actually for food security, because Kiribati is already not in a great position to be growing crops and the like. And he said that's, the food security angle is what we're very worried about, in addition to the migration or displacement side of things. Yeah, I mean, I think what's also interesting is that within our region, it's often, in fact, globally, it is often the most affected communities that are already way ahead of the curve on this. So Fiji has planned relocation guidelines. On account of disasters and climate change, it's already relocating villages, as has been said before, not great distances, often quite close by, up a hill, but to safeguard communities and assets and livelihoods. They've developed a trust fund. New Zealand's contributed to that trust fund to help fund the relocations, because they don't come cheap. That's an extremely expensive process. Australia could likewise contribute to that. Vanuatu also has an internal displacement policy. So, in addition to providing support to our Pacific communities, I think if we also think of migration as a similar way of doing so, it's a win-win for Australia and our neighbours. And that's demonstrated, for example, by the seasonal work program that we have. That's had dramatic and positive impacts on the lives of Pacific Islanders who are involved. To the extent that a World Bank survey showed that most workers took home more than 4 times what they would otherwise be able to earn in a year. And I think, in Tonga, the scheme is now more important than aid and trade combined. And some other sort of knock-on effects from that, which I found fascinating, were that the children of seasonal workers are 10 to 14% more likely to attend school in Tonga than other Tongan children. Now, that's not to say the schemes are absolutely perfect. We've seen extremely disturbing stories of exploitation within Australia. And obviously, that's not part and parcel of a scheme. They are ramifications of a scheme that need to be changed and addressed. But I think, to the extent that Australia works with Pacific communities to develop migration opportunities that are welcomed, we've seen through the pandemic how reliant we are, and the labour force that we need. So from Australia's perspective, it's economically sound, as well as, I would argue, of enormous cultural importance and social importance, not to say humanitarian importance.
No, thank you so much. That's really fascinating. Now, I just want to open up to a few questions that I've gotten from the audience. So first of all, I guess a question for all of you. What changes need to be implemented at the grassroots level, such as the community and individuals? What can the average person do? Who wants to go first?
I'll have a go at it. It depends which part of the world you're looking at. Very, very different in Australia. if you're sitting in the Sahel. I think he had the great conversation with the guy from the UN Population Fund yesterday, last night, and he really was he was talking to him about what does African values, because a lot of the time when you're working internationally out of Africa, they say, well, look, is that match with African values? And so we dug in, so I asked him the question, as we dug into it more deeply, it really came back to community-led projects aligned with the traditions of the community. Okay, and quite often those traditions are different than what we'd like them to be, maybe coming from a Western perspective. But for me, we've got to get a lot in the developing world. We spend a lot of lip service on it, but not a real action around it. It's having community-led projects. So a lot of the time, the community does know what they need best. Okay, and they also know quite often the best way how to do it, and that can be augmented with knowledge, and can be augmented with technology and such. But like, it's much more community-led projects and sort of down much more at a micro level. Problems that are a lot harder to manage because they're smaller. So that's one angle. The second angle from the West, depends on what you're looking at. So if you're looking at climate change, people need to be a lot more cognizant of the basis of the consumption-based economy and the amount of resources which get consumed with it. Also, I think a number of Jane's points there were really good on the last comment, and sort of there's all sorts of areas in Australia where we've got all sorts of labour shortages. We may have unemployment overall, but there's lots of areas, and part of it is like the seasonal fruit pickers, for example, which is just one of many. So you have immigration programs which can be built around climate refugees, and have that built around the areas where we've got a shortage of immigration. But I guess and so sort of people get active and start to really sort of look at their own personal life and what they can do, that and their own views on it. I think that's something people can do. But sort of how can I put it? The problem and the shock is big enough, it'll overpower any system. So it's 240 million people in Indonesia, and the population growth rate's decreasing, but it's still reasonably strong. You get bad enough shock and you get 10% of those people migrating, okay, and that could be trying to get to Australia. There's no way Australia can hope to achieve it, hope to be able to cope with it. Absolutely impossible. So it really comes back to building resilience in these societies. Good news with Indonesia, its resilience, if we measure it over the last decade, it's got one of the better performances globally. But it's all about resilience. So because we see with countries which have got, from our measures of resilience, which we call positive peace, but the countries with high resilience don't actually have much in the way of ecological shocks they can't deal with, because they're generally richer countries that can put in the precautions. They've got lower population growth. They're able to capture enough water which are adequate for our people. And where they can't get the right agricultural mix, they've got export industries to generate the income to put it in. So this is all, in many ways, is back to what we'd see as societal resilience. And so that's another big subject, but we haven't got time for now.
No, and I just wanted to ask another, try to fit in a couple more questions from the audience. So try to keep your answers, quick and concise. So another question is, why is Australia one of the biggest sources of climate pollution, why is Australia one of the biggest sources of climate pollution worldwide, despite having only a fraction of the population? Robert, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, so we're not one of the largest sources of emissions worldwide, direct emissions, but we're the largest exporter of coal in the world by far. Indonesia is the second largest exporter, and we export twice as much as they do. So Now, the Paris Agreement doesn't, in terms of obligations, doesn't address exports of coal that then others burn to release greenhouse gases. But if you include that, then Australian exports are contributing. Of course, they're meeting a demand, which is understandable. But so in that respect, we are quite a major emitter. And the other respect in which we're an emitter, again, not captured in the Paris Agreement, is even though we as globally are emitting a small amount per capita because we have such a small population, we're also one of the major emitters. So, so yes, there's a difference between what we mean by the major emitter and also which of these things is captured under the Paris Agreement, the international obligations.
Yeah, I'll just chime in quickly with a comment. And so, yes, overall the emissions are low, but the per capita emissions are really quite high. I think that's quite often what comes up in the various graphs you see. But one of the points which is really going to get debated hotly over the next 5 years is the tariffs on the high emission countries on the goods they export. Now, the debate around it, and it's purely a political debate, has no logic, is you either do it where the manufacturing occurs or you do it where the raw resources used in the manufacturing are extracted. So for Australia, for iron ore and for coal, if it came down to that, that would be devastating for our economy. So countries like China pushing very, very hard for it to be at the point of extraction, not at the point of manufacturing. And if you think of the EU and you think of the US, to some extent, that's probably it'd be a beneficial approach for them. So I think Australia, moving forward on this, if it's seen as a bad guy, it's just going to make it much, much harder as it gets into these kind of negotiations to get the outcome it'd like.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. When should the ecological threats to humanity be taught at school to students? Jane, you haven't spoken in a while. Did you want to take the lead on this one?
Well, now I would say, I mean, I think that's part of the response maybe to the earlier questions as well, is that if you don't have sufficient awareness, which needs to come in at a very young age, then how do you expect these problems to be tackled? And I think what is actually so fascinating is that, maybe it's not fascinating, maybe it's to be expected, but youth and young people are the people who are really driving so many of these campaigns because it's their future. And I think in the, my area of international law, a lot of the litigation does now relate to the rights of children and the rights of future generations. So yes, I think it should be compulsory reading.
Can I just add one very quick point to that? When I was a boy, we used to not think twice about when we were in the car throwing rubbish out the window. We just it didn't even occur to us. And now, as a result of the public campaigns by the government, if any of us did that today, we'd feel horribly guilty doing that. So yeah, there is a power of changing approaches and attitudes that governments have a role to play in doing that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think every time I see the School Strikes for Climate, it just brings me a lot of hope for the future. I think it's a nice, it's a nice reminder that that there is hope, in the face of, all of this terrible news and tragic projections. And I think it's really easy to feel helpless and powerless, but, and especially, Robert and Jane, from your stories as well in different countries overseas, and what people are doing in the community strength of those countries. I think that's a really nice message as well to remember when we're feeling pretty down about all of this. Now, it is time to wrap up. So I will just throw back to Ahmed, and I'll just quickly say thank you so much for all of your absolutely fascinating answers. And I've learnt a lot, and I hope other people in the audience have too. And we're all a little bit more aware of these issues and the issues to come.
Thanks, Anthea, and thank you to all our panelists. We could have gone on for another hour or two at least to even get a few more layers covered off, because there's a lot to discuss. There's definitely a lot that we can do as well. Like what Robert said, I think if individually and collectively, if we could start off with ourselves and remind our loved ones and people who are dear to us about doing the right thing, particularly with simple things like throwing rubbish into the bin, being conservative with the water usage and food usage, at least we'll play our part, and hopefully that will sort of trickle upwards to government and they can do all the right thing as well. So thank you everyone for your contribution today and for the work that you are doing in this space, for your thought leadership, for your advocacy and your agency. We really appreciate that. For those who'd like to get more information about the report that the Institute for Economics and Peace, you can whiz over to their website, economicsandpeace.org, and you can download the Ecological Threat Register 2021 and have a look at the report and look at some of the findings. So thank you to all our panelists, and particularly you, Anthea, for moderating a wonderful conversation. I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation today. Look out for more webinars on the AIS website. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Oh, not us.
And